On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army held out for only 5 days before surrendering to one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen. Almost overnight, German soldiers flooded the streets of Amsterdam, Haarlem, and Rotterdam. Nazi flags replaced Dutch ones on every public building and town square. Curfews were imposed, new laws were passed, and an entirely new system of fear was put in place. Jewish citizens were stripped of their rights almost immediately, with no warning and no appeal. Families began disappearing from their homes, taken in the middle of the night by soldiers who knocked on doors without explanation. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and trust in community slowly eroded. For most Dutch people, the only real choice felt like survival. Keep your head down, go to work, raise your children, and pretend the world hadn't changed. Around 90% of the population did exactly that, choosing quiet endurance over open resistance. But a small number of people looked at what was happening around them and made a different choice entirely. They chose to fight back, even knowing the consequences. Among them would be some of the most unlikely resistance fighters in the history of the Second World War. Their story begins not in a military barracks or a government office, but in a tiny apartment in Haarlem. It begins with a mother, 2 daughters, and a knock on the door. Freddie Overstegen was only 14 years old when a resistance commander named Frans van der Wiel came to her family's door in 1941. He didn't arrive by accident. He came because the Overstegens were already known in resistance circles. Their mother, Treintje, was a committed communist who had spent years hiding Jewish refugees and political fugitives inside their small apartment. Freddie and her older sister, Truus, had grown up sharing their beds with strangers whose names they often didn't know. People who needed a safe place to sleep for a night or a week. From the very first weeks of the occupation, the sisters had been distributing illegal pamphlets and anti-Nazi newspapers across the city. They pasted resistance posters over German propaganda in the dead of night. 2 girls on bicycles, slipping through the darkness before anyone could catch them. When van der Wiel arrived, he was honest about what joining the resistance would actually mean: sabotage, arson, intelligence gathering, and when necessary, killing. He didn't soften it or dress it up. He told them exactly what they were being asked to do. Truus looked at her little sister, and Freddie grinned with the casual fearlessness of someone who had never been taught to be afraid. Their mother had only one piece of advice before they walked out the door into the war. She told them, "Always stay human." Those 3 words would follow both sisters for the rest of their lives, shaping every decision they made, no matter how dark things became. They were teenagers, but from that moment on, they were also soldiers. Beneath a farmhouse on the outskirts of Haarlem, in an underground shed that smelled of damp earth and stored vegetables, the Overstegen sisters learned to become fighters. They were taught how to shoot, not just how to hold a pistol, but how to aim under pressure, how to stay calm when everything inside you is screaming to run. They learned which targets the resistance considered priorities and why. They studied the geography of their operations, memorizing streets, escape routes, and the patterns of German patrols. Their earliest missions weren't assassinations. They were used as decoys, something they were uniquely suited for. 2 young girls approaching a Nazi guard with a smile and easy laughter raised no suspicion whatsoever. While they kept soldiers distracted with conversation, resistance fighters crept in behind them to set fires, plant explosives, and destroy supply depots. It worked with remarkable consistency because no one looked at 2 laughing teenage girls and saw a threat. That invisibility was the weapon, not the pistol hidden under a coat, but the innocence itself. The ability to stand right in front of an enemy and be completely overlooked. But that innocence was slowly being spent with every operation, every fire, every close call. The work was growing more dangerous and more permanent. The sisters could feel the shift happening inside them, a hardening that was necessary but came at a cost. They were no longer just girls pasting posters in the dark. They were becoming something the Nazis had no category for. In 1942, resistance intelligence uncovered something that demanded immediate action. A Dutch collaborator, a woman working with the Nazis, had compiled a detailed registry of names and addresses identifying every Jewish family in her region. She was preparing to hand that list directly to the Gestapo, and once she did, hundreds of people would be rounded up and deported. Entire families, elderly grandparents, children. The list was effectively a mass death sentence waiting to be delivered. The resistance gave the assignment to Freddie Oversteegen, who was still only 15 years old. She rode her bicycle to the park where the woman would be, arrived calmly, and found her sitting on a bench, completely unsuspecting. Freddie approached with braided pigtails and a relaxed, easy smile, looking for all the world like a harmless young girl. She asked the woman her name. The woman told her. Freddie pulled out her pistol and shot her dead. Then she got back on her bicycle and rode away. Later, Freddie described the feeling that came over her in the immediate aftermath, a feeling she said never left her, no matter how many times she pulled the trigger. The first thing you want to do when you shoot somebody, she said, is to pick them up. That instinct, to help, to undo, to reach toward the person you just destroyed, was not guilt exactly. It was something more complicated. It was the sign that she was still human. She had done what was necessary to save hundreds of lives, and she had also done something she would carry forever. Both things were true at the same time. In 1943, a third member joined the resistance cell in Haarlem, and she was unlike anyone who had come before. Her name was Janetje Johanna Schaft, but everyone called her Hani. She came from a respectable middle-class family. Her father was a teacher, and she had been studying law at the University of Amsterdam with plans to become a human rights attorney. She was not born into resistance the way the Oversteegen sisters were. She arrived at it through a single moment of moral clarity. When the Nazis demanded that all students sign a loyalty oath to the Third Reich, Hani refused without hesitation. She was expelled from the university. She didn't go home. She went underground. She had 3 physical features that would define her resistance career and ultimately lead to her death: bright red hair, pale skin, green eyes. A face that witnesses remembered long after she had disappeared around a corner. Vandervelde tested her the same way he had tested the Oversteegen sisters. He handed her a gun and sent her to assassinate a target. Her hands shook. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. The gun was empty. It was a test of nerve, not marksmanship, and she had passed. Now the cell had 3 women, each with a distinct role. Hani was the planner, methodical, detail-oriented, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Truus was the decision-maker, cold under pressure, the one who made the hard calls when no good options existed. Freddie was the scout. She mapped every operation in advance and knew every escape route before the mission even began. Together, they were something the Nazi military apparatus had not prepared for and could not easily defend against. As the occupation deepened through 1943 and into 1944, the 3 women developed a set of operational techniques that were as effective as they were audacious. The forest method was among the most coldly efficient. One of the sisters would enter a bar or tavern frequented by German officers, strike up a conversation, laugh at their jokes, and lean in close enough to seem interested. Then she would suggest going for a walk in the woods. The officers always agreed. Deep in the trees, away from roads and witnesses, the other sister would already be waiting. One shot, a hole already dug. 2 girls cycling home through the dark. The bicycle was another core method. Truce would pedal while Freddie rode behind her, pistol ready, and they would identify a target walking the street, pass him, fire, and keep riding. Just 2 girls on a bicycle, nothing to see. The doorstep involved following a target, learning his address and schedule, then knocking. When he opened his door, he saw a young girl, harmless, perhaps confused, perhaps lost. By the time recognition reached his eyes, it was already too late. Between targeted killings, the 3 women conducted an enormous range of other resistance operations. They blew up railway lines used to transport Jewish prisoners to concentration camps. They forged identity documents to protect people in hiding. They smuggled Jewish children across the border in the middle of the night, sometimes carrying them in their arms through open fields and forests. They passed intelligence on German troop movements to Allied forces. They were not simply assassins. They were the backbone of an entire network of survival. In 1943, an order came down from resistance leadership that put the 3 women's principles to a direct test. The target was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands, and one of the most powerful Nazi officials in the entire country. The mission was not to kill him. It was to kidnap his children and use them as leverage to force the release of resistance prisoners. And if he refused to cooperate, they were to kill the children. Freddie, Truce, and Hani refused the order without hesitation or debate. "We are not Hitlerites," Freddie said. "Resistance fighters don't murder children." It was a defining moment for all 3 women, a clear and unambiguous statement of where their moral boundary lay. They had killed people. They would kill more. But children were not targets. Full stop. That line existed regardless of who gave the order or what the strategic argument was. That same year, Truce was cycling through Haarlem when she witnessed a Dutch SS soldier, a Dutchman who had voluntarily joined the Nazi forces, grab an infant from a screaming family. He held the baby up and smashed it against a wall. The child died instantly. Truce stopped her bicycle, pulled out her pistol, and shot the soldier dead in the street. No orders, no planning, no mission briefing. Just an immediate, instinctive act of intervention against an act of pure evil. "That wasn't a mission," she said later, "but I don't regret it. Some things don't need orders." The distinction between the 2 events, the order they refused and the action they took, says everything about the kind of people they were. They killed when they had to, never when they were told to. By 1944, the Nazis had begun to understand that someone was systematically hunting them. Officers were dying in forests and on street corners. Railway lines were being sabotaged. A pattern was emerging, and at the center of it was a woman. Red hair, green eyes, pale skin. Bulletins went out across the entire Netherlands. Find the girl with the red hair. Hani Schaft was now one of the most wanted people in occupied Holland. She responded by dyeing her hair black, changing her glasses, and altering her routes. But she didn't stop operating. She couldn't, and she knew it. The work was too important, and the war was too close to its end for anyone to stand down. In June 1944, Hani and a fellow resistance fighter were sent to eliminate a Dutch collaborator. The mission went badly wrong. Her partner was shot in the stomach and captured. Delirious from blood loss during interrogation, he was tricked by a Gestapo officer posing as a resistance member. In his confusion and agony, he gave up Hani's home address. He died shortly afterward, never knowing what he had revealed. The Gestapo raided her family home immediately. They arrested both of her parents and sent them to a concentration camp. Hani went into deep hiding, effectively disappearing from the network. For months, she couldn't fight. If she surfaced, the entire network around her would be swept up in the dragnet that was hunting her. She waited in hiding, knowing the war was almost over, knowing her parents were suffering because of her, and knowing that going back out would almost certainly get her killed. But she couldn't stay hidden forever. She had never been built for stillness. March 21st, 1945. The war was almost over, and everyone in the Netherlands knew it. Allied forces were advancing steadily, and liberation was now a matter of weeks rather than months. There was even an unofficial ceasefire agreement in place. The Nazis had agreed to stop executing Dutch civilians, and the resistance had agreed to stand down. Hani Schaft was cycling through Haarlem carrying illegal newspapers and a loaded pistol when she was stopped at a checkpoint. It was the kind of stop she had navigated dozens of times before, a routine check at a routine location. But this time, they searched her more carefully. They found everything. She was arrested immediately and taken to Amsterdam's prison, where interrogators began the process of working out exactly who they had caught. Then, someone noticed something during questioning. Her hair was black, but the roots were growing in red. They had found the girl with the red hair. Despite everything the Gestapo could bring to bear during her interrogation, Hani's behavior was extraordinary. She confirmed her kills. She admitted to what she had done and didn't attempt to minimize it or deny it. But she told them absolutely nothing useful. Not a single name, not a safe house address, not a meeting location. Not one detail that could be used to unravel the network she had spent 4 years building and protecting. Freddie and Truus were never mentioned, not once. She had been caught because of an exhausted, dying man's accidental betrayal, and in the end, she would die carrying every name she had ever known as a secret. Her silence was perhaps the most important operation she ever ran. April 17, 1945, 18 days before the Netherlands would be liberated. 2 Dutch collaborators drove Hani Schaft to the sand dunes of Overveen on the outskirts of Haarlem, the same dunes where hundreds of resistance fighters had already been executed and buried. The dunes were the Nazis' killing ground, a place where the sand swallowed the evidence of what they had done. The first executioner raised his pistol and fired. The bullet grazed her head. She fell into the sand, wounded but alive, bleeding but conscious. She looked up at the man who had just failed to kill her. What she said in that moment has been remembered ever since. "I shoot better than you." It was not bravado. It was simply the truth, delivered by a woman who had been shooting Nazis for 2 years and knew it. The second man raised a submachine gun and fired. Hani Schaft died in the dunes at 24 years old. 18 days before the liberation she had spent 4 years fighting to bring about. They buried her in a shallow grave, so shallow that her red hair was visible above the surface of the sand. The hair she had dyed black to hide, the hair that had ultimately given her away, now marked her resting place for anyone who looked. She had survived the entire occupation only to be killed in its final days by people who were themselves already on the losing side of a finished war. It was the kind of ending that felt almost impossible to accept, the kind of loss that sits in the chest long after you stop reading about it. The Netherlands was liberated on May 5, 1945, exactly 18 days after Hani Schaft was killed in the dunes. When recovery teams swept through Overveen after the liberation, they found 422 bodies buried in the sand. 421 men. one woman. Hannie Schaft was given a full state funeral, attended by thousands. Queen Wilhelmina herself called her the symbol of the Dutch resistance, a national hero whose sacrifice represented everything the country had endured and fought for during 5 years of occupation. It was a profound and deserved recognition, but it was incomplete in a way that would take decades to address. Freddy and Truus Overstegen, the two teenage girls who had been fighting since 1941, who had shot Nazi officers in forests, blown up railway lines, smuggled Jewish children across borders, and refused direct orders to murder innocent children, received nothing. The reason was not their actions, which were just as heroic as Hannie's. The reason was politics. In the Cold War years that followed the Second World War, the Overstegen sisters' communist background made them inconvenient. It was enough to erase them from the official narrative entirely. Two of the most effective resistance fighters the Netherlands had produced were quietly set aside, treated with suspicion, and left out of the history books. Truus turned to sculpture, building memorials to the resistance and writing about her experiences. She refused to be quiet or invisible. Freddy tried to build a quiet domestic life, but the nightmares came every year without fail. Every May 4th, Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, she woke up in dread, carrying the weight of everything she had done and everything that had been done around her. In 2014, 69 years after the end of the Second World War, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte finally invited Freddy and Truus Overstegen to an official ceremony. He awarded them the Mobilisatieklaus, a military decoration for wartime service. Freddy was 89 years old. Truus was 91. Freddy's son said afterward that it was the happiest day of his mother's life. 69 years of waiting for someone in power to simply say, "We see what you did, and we are grateful." Truus Overstegen died on June 18, 2016, at the age of 92, after a lifetime of making sure people did not forget. Freddy Overstegen died on September 5, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday, having outlived almost everyone who had tried to kill her. For the rest of her life, Freddy visited Hannie Schaft's grave regularly and left red roses. For the friend who never made it home, who died in the dunes 18 days too soon. When people asked how many people she had killed, her answer never changed. One should not ask a soldier any of that. She never gave a number. Neither did Truus. Some burdens are carried alone. When Truus was asked what advice she had for future generations, she repeated the words her mother had spoken at a doorway in Haarlem in 1941, before two teenage girls walked out into a war. When you have to make a decision, it must be the right one, and you must always remain human. The Nazis murdered millions, systematically, industrially, without remorse or hesitation. They industrialized the removal of their own humanity and called it efficiency. These three women killed people too, and they sat with that fact every single day for the rest of their lives. They cried after every kill. They refused to harm children. They protected their networks to the end. That is the difference between resistance and atrocity, between necessity and evil. Of the entire Dutch population during the occupation, only about 5% actively resisted. Of that 5%, only a handful of women ever took up arms. Freddy Overstegen was one of them, a 14-year-old girl with braided pigtails, a pistol in her bicycle basket, and her mother's voice in her ear. Stay human. She did, until the very end.